Before I sort of get into the details of environment and health, I want to tell you a little bit more about myself in sort of the big picture of how I see that role. I am a professor, like Rayan mentioned, at Columbia University here in New York City. Like most people in New York, I'm not from New York. Nobody, it seems like, it's from New York. I grew up in Idaho, central Idaho, between two towns that nobody's heard of. So pretty much a quiet little spot in central Idaho, and have lived in New York about 10 years. Although I study chemistry and sort of environment a lot across the world, I'm going to mostly be focusing today on work that we do with the Columbia University Superfund Research Program, in particular, and as well as tribal in South Dakota. And really, these are projects that I need to acknowledge two people specifically, Anna Navasasian and Marcia O'Leary, both here at Columbia, who've been involved. I'm also going to talk about data and work that has been conducted by a lot of different people. Just going back to my title slide here for a second. I'm going to show data, again, that's been collected by largely a group of undergraduates so far in my group, as well as a few graduate students, Maya Spar, Athena Neum, and some others. And in particular here for the data I'm talking about today, Marcia and Tracy Zacher from Missouri Breaks and Rena Red Cloud from the Water Resources Department at Oglala Sioux Tribe are really important parts of what we've been working on here. Just to make sure I don't forget to acknowledge everybody right up front, I want to do that right. First thing I want to sort of present to you, I'm also a photographer, so I try to have some pictures that are hopefully relevant to the story here. I want to sort of give you my perception of the word environment, and this really has a lot to do with, it turns out, with human health, in my opinion. So environment comes from a French word. It means surroundings. I think what's really important about there is the perspective there, that it describes an individual or an entity and the things that are around it. You can't have an environment without being placed in it. And also what that really means inherently is that your environment is different from somebody else's. In this is a picture of a horse I took in South Dakota at a windmill where there's a well for the horse. The point is, this horse's environment is in partly the same of people who might live next to it, but also different than others. And everybody has a different kind of environment that they're faced with and interact with. That really means that their environment and the exposures and the risks to them are also unique, imposed by that environment. It also means something else, and that is, when you think about your surroundings, there's a variety of ways to think about them. There are surroundings at all different scales, and these are just examples here to sort of think about. On some scale, there's this immediate surroundings around you, and on another scale, they include the larger world. So these are two pictures of my daughter. One was from a field trip yesterday that I took her on here in New York City, going through Times Square. One is visiting my family out in Idaho over the summer. And we're both seeing very different local environments here, but again, we're part of something larger. So if you think about it, again, from this sort of perspective, you can think about your environment being this very small thing, or all the way up to a very big thing like the whole country, or in fact, the world. And that really also means that some things that fall into your environment are your problem, and some might not in other cases. It really sets up also the distinction between of perspective. You have this complication of individual environments and communal environments that we really also have to think of in how we solve problems. And that really also then relates to the words that we use for environment. I think it's interesting. I looked up the synonyms for environment, and it includes home. right? So your home at the very smallest scale in some ways is really an environment. And it also includes something as large as the natural world or the earth. And so just to give you two examples for that, these are two different local environments from airplane wings that I've seen in places I work in Cambodia and New York City here. And here's my home here in New York. And here is a home in Cambodia. They're both homes. In many ways, the things that we face inside them are similar. And in many ways, so we have all of these things that sort of play together, and we think about the environment and then end up controlling the kinds of issues that we face. And so our interaction with health is really unique to that. And that in mind, I want to present some environmental perspectives on contamination. In this case, I'm focusing primarily on OST lands in Southwest South Dakota. Sounds kind of odd to put too many Souths together there, but these are some water samples. The map here is largely the Oglala Sioux Tribe area on Pine Ridge, and these are water samples I have collected in the last 6 months or so, looking at water samples, uranium concentrations. These are all from rivers and streams for the most part here. The point being, here we have an environment, right? This is on some scale, this is a community or a set of communities, but at individual scales, any individual random spot that we looked at on the map, not everybody has the same amount of, in this case, uranium in their well. Or sorry, not in their well, in their water. And of course, there is another map of the distribution of uranium in water that we could present as well. And so just to show you a little bit about how that works, this is work recently published that we also have, where we're looking at the amount of both arsenic and uranium in groundwater wells, again, largely from Strong Heart Study participants. What you can see in this map is that some places people have higher uranium in water than they should. Some places people have higher arsenic. And in fact, as it turns out, in some places you have both. And that's a really important thing to think about. Having both is unfortunately a double whammy, not only from health, but it represents an environmental and a technological complication in dealing with our environment. And that is, it's not so easy to treat uranium and arsenic at the same time. So in fact, that's a big constraint on how these systems work. Those surface waters also, just the same, have a very similar pattern where arsenic and uranium concentrations also, in many cases, are correlated and are high in both. So what does this mean? If we have a water sample, either a surface water or a groundwater sample, a drinking water sample in either case, if it has high arsenic, there's a good chance it has high uranium, and we would have to treat both of them, deal with those contaminations in some ways very differently. Well, one of the things as a chemist I work on is why. Why is this the case? And again, how can we use that hopefully to solve problems? Because it's important to actually work on solutions to environmental issues that to the extent we can. And so here is a description of a little bit of how we do that. Observations to think about with a map like this. On one scale, there's a spatial pattern potentially in data. What's important to realize here, if you looked at a map, you'd say, maybe. It's not always super obvious how those spatial patterns express themselves. And those complications, that spatial complexity is something we try to make sense of. And so one of the things that we can see from this data when we start to look at it in mapping form is that, especially for the places where arsenic and uranium are both contaminants, they tend to be places along the boundary between what is called the Arickaree Formation. That's the sandy part of Pine Ridge that most people sort of live on, and the Pierre Formation underneath, which is the clay that basically holds the ground, separates the groundwater that people drink from well that's way, way, way deeper. And so what most people do is they drink water from that sand just above this clay at the bottom that sort of holds all the water into an aquifer. And when you live near the edge, it turns out you also live in a place where you're sampling probably water that's really close to that boundary. So in space, lateral space, when you look at it in a map, you see the places where there's more uranium and arsenic contamination are usually within a few kilometers or a mile or two. The boundary between those, with some exceptions. If you look at it in a little bit more conceptual form, when this is drive-by geology, which is one of my specialties here. A picture here, you can really see this more clearly. That boundary, although you see it like a line here on a map between two colors, the blue color and the brown color in this case, what you can actually see here is that sand that people are living on up here on the higher area is basically, the boundary between them is actually also described where there's a cut in the landscape down into the Badlands. And what we have here is the water sort of flows down and percolates along the boundary between those. And the sand up here holds that water and holds where people live. And then down here in the bottom of the canyon, there's essentially this clay material that is a little bit different. And so you see that sort of motif across the landscape. There's another view of it, another view of it. And what's really important here is there's actually also groundwater seeping out here. There's actually springs, which I'm sure many have wandering in the hills make use of regularly. And in fact, that's where we bring our animals to eat and drink as well. All those springs are also, unfortunately, also seem to have water that's likely to be contaminated, because that boundary is really where things are coming from. You also have places that are lower on the landscape that's closer to that boundary. This is a lower area also from Pine Ridge, where you can see these lower, in this case, it's a little pond, lake impoundment, also as an environment where it's close enough that actually the water in it also contains, very similar to the water underground, higher arsenic and uranium. So with that in mind, what we'd really like to know is, well, okay, we know that that boundary is what's going on there. Well, how does that work and why? And so this is just an expression of how we actually do that. Rayanne mentioned I use something called a synchrotron. That's sort of, it sounds like a fancy thing, and indeed it is. This is a picture of a small one, which is in Canada. This synchrotron, I think, is about 600 meters across or something, so a quarter mile or something. The biggest synchrotrons are more than 1 mile across, so very big machines and cost billions of dollars to make. But the reason they're nice is we can actually do something pretty awesome with them. If we take them to a specific little station like this one here, which is a piece of instrument that I'm using, I can actually take something like this, which is the Arickaree sand from South Dakota, take a handful of it, quite literally, and bring it to a synchrotron. In this case, I'm putting a picture of a synchrotron in New York here at Brookhaven National Laboratory in an instrument, and actually map where the uranium and the arsenic is in that sample directly, and actually use it to figure out what's going on. And make maps like this at the tiniest scales, the scale of individual sand grains. What we do when we do this is we can actually see something pretty cool from a scientific standpoint, and it's something that really helps us understand the problem. Usually, arsenic, especially, and arsenic and uranium both, actually stick to iron. If you want to think about the environment. There's one important trait to know about the iron, the brown color in soils and the reddish brown colors that we see in rocks and soils so often. That's rust basically, and that rust has the property of being incredibly important at holding on to uranium and arsenic and stuff like that. So normally when you look at a soil at this scale, what you see is anywhere there's a little bit of iron, all the other stuff that matters for contamination, like these things like uranium and arsenic, would stick to it and they would be found together. And what we see in this image is something completely different. We see places where there's iron that are colored red, places that are uranium colored green, and places that are colored orange, or sorry, not orange, blue, have arsenic. And none of them are found together. So what that is saying is, because of the chemistry that we have happening in our soil or sediments here in this kind of material that's really common across this region, the uranium and the arsenic don't stick to the iron like they do in other places. That's a problem. That's one of the reasons. And the fact that it's not sticking to that iron means not only does it does stick to some things, but it just doesn't stick as well. And that's why there's arsenic and uranium in the water. Although there isn't very much arsenic and uranium in the sediment, the sand doesn't actually have any more than most other rocks for the most part. But unfortunately, it's in a form that when there's water there, it stays in the water. Or if new water comes in, it actually comes off of the sand and goes into the water at a level that's high enough to cause problems. Okay, so this is sort of an example of the chemistry that we kind of try to do to solve things, okay? Or to figure out how things work. We'll come back to that chemistry in a second when we think about how to deal with the solutions problem. The next kind of science that we kind of do on environmental scales here is to think about how can we predict where contamination might be within the environment. The whole bunch of reasons we want to do that. These are pictures across South Dakota at different scales, right, that are going to end up relating to our question. Escape here, we have, in this case, this is the Rapid Creek, I believe. I took it from the window from the light to Rapid City. Here we have a windmill well out across the prairie, and here we have a house which some of you probably will recognize as not an actual house. It's actually Missouri Breaks. But sort of symbolic of a specific location. Windmill well and that building are both places that are found within that landscape. And if we'd like to know if those places are contaminated, or even better, if for example, in the case of the windmill well, we'd like it to be not contaminated, and we'd like to know if we could put it within one place, where should we put it so that it wouldn't have contamination in it? To do that, we need to know how to predict where contamination is or where it isn't. Hopefully, again, before we put in the well would be handy so that we could do something useful. So related to that, what I want to present is how might we make predictions? And to think about it, I want to show something that's very important to this, but it's also a kind of a concept, again, in relating our environment to do things like this. And that is, if we understand those chemical processes that are happening, we actually can transfer the information from one place to another. So although we might study the environment in one place, it has a relevance directly to other places that we go. In this case, this is a project, the results of many years of research that we did in Cambodia. So this is a map of Cambodia here in the map, and a map of about 40,000 water samples that we collected across Cambodia to understand where arsenic is a problem. It turns out arsenic in Cambodia is a very big problem. And the grayscale image underneath the map tells you how often water covers that land. So how there's flooding that occurs in Cambodia very often. I showed you a picture of some of that flooding earlier. And what you can see in panel B is the amount of flooding and how frequently it floods, how long it floods and how frequently actually is predictive of where arsenic is going to be high in the groundwater underneath those points, basically. So arsenic tends to be found in places that flood about every other year, 50% flood frequency. And when they do flood, they flood for 2 or 3 months. So in Cambodia, we can use that. If we could find places that do that, we would actually understand into large part where arsenic might be found in those environments. Well, so this paper we just published, it turns out we can use exactly the same model. This predictive approach is based on the fact that arsenic usually goes into water when goes into groundwater when there's no oxygen present, and you need a certain amount of water covering soil and for a certain amount of time for the oxygen to disappear from the water. So we can use the same kind of principle to actually make predictions elsewhere. And we can actually do this as a prediction. We can literally take this prediction and transfer it, for example, to our South Dakota region. It turns out the transferring is not perfect, but it actually works pretty well to think about how predictions work. And so this is a figure showing just how that kind of works. So if we measured a whole bunch of wells in South Dakota, in this case, we used, I think, all of South Dakota as for, you know, where we have a well that's been measured, not just OST. You can see, you know, most often there's a lot of wells, luckily, that are below 10 parts per billion, which is the safe drinking water limit. And so if we look at all of the wells in that region, it's like 1,000 wells or several hundred wells in OST. We can actually see, well, if we make a prediction using the model that we develop like this, we can actually predict the real concentration. This is what the predictions are for the wells that were actually low in arsenic. We can see most of them are predicted to be low, and there's a few that we miss that are higher than we predicted. It's okay to be predicting more than there is, because in some ways that is an issue that sort of helps with accuracy. But what we're doing is we're trying to improve this currently. So our current research is how to that can actually make this prediction more accurate. It turns out using greenness, for example, how green a landscape is. Some places that have more water tend to be greener. Most people who live in a nominally arid area will recognize that pretty quickly. You know, you go down to the bottoms of the valleys and that's where the trees are and where the grass is green, and at the top of the hills, it tends to be browner. And so the amount of greenness is also related to how much water is present. So because water matters, we can use things like that to actually refine these models and make them more accurate. And so Adina Kasasu DeLuca, who is the student who's really been involved with this, is actually sort of working on incorporating other variables to make these kinds of predictions. I'll call them more intelligent and accurate. Okay. The next thing I want to sort of present to you is a little bit about what do we do once we have an environmental problem, right? Like, again, it's one thing to know where we start understanding why chemistry is the way it is or why a contaminant this, but in real life, once we know we have contamination, we have to do something to try to address it. And so I want to talk a little bit about how we try and do that and what our approaches are, again, specifically here in Oglala Sioux tribal lands. Of course, if you have bad water in a well, typically the best answer is probably to have access to a regularly tested, regulated community water supply, public water supply that somebody else takes care of. Not that they're going to do perfectly, but they're going to do better than us in general, because, that's their job. There's somebody who has a job of doing that. Okay, and so doing that is a really important thing in trying to develop safe water supplies. And there's a good example of that, right? We try to bring water supplies for rural water supplies across lands here through a water district that's specifically designed to provide drinking water. There's a sign from that, right? If you're going to use a community water supply or a private one, though, it's best to have water that's clean to begin with. This sounds obvious, but it isn't always obvious to everybody. So you should really think of fixing a water supply as a fallback option. So if we can find a clean water supply, it's really usually better to use it than to do with the less clean water that comes out of a different well. And you'll see this across many areas of the world, right? You know, including places like Kyle, where when they have South Dakota, where, you know, there are community water supplies like all the others that are local that have, in some cases, arsenic and uranium contamination. When they identify them, in general, they switch to others that have better water quality. In some cases, though, people live in rural areas. Where I grew up was definitely one of those places. I can't imagine they're going to have a water supply for a community water supply anytime soon where I grew up. So that's not really an option, and we do have to do treatment. Okay, so if we do treatment, one thing we really want to think about is how can we treat that water so that it will address the problems it has. In our case here, we're talking about arsenic and uranium, but everywhere has unique issues, right? Everyone's environment is different and has different things they need to treat. So how do we do that? Well, although I said our environment in South Dakota, at least where the sand is, the iron things didn't stick to very well. The arsenic and uranium was not sticking. Normally, that's not the case. And so if we can control the environment a little bit and actually make some and produce an iron oxide, it turns out most things will stick to it at least well enough to be able to treat water. And so probably the most standard method people use for treating water for chemical contaminants is using an iron or an aluminum oxide for that reason. They're just very small particles, things like to stick to them, and they really do work. So what's really important is you can think of it like musical chairs. There's this surface on the surface of these iron oxides that are, it's a powder, so there's a lot of surface. That's handy. So it can hold a lot of stuff, and the contaminants will stick to it until they run out of space. So it is really important to realize all water treatment essentially is finite. Eventually you run out and you have to put new iron oxides in there, and you always have to supply materials for that to work. Okay, our hope in our case is to make that supply happen naturally using microbes. So one of my current research areas is how can we use microbial populations and actually photosynthesis, microbes that do photosynthesis specifically, to actually make these iron oxides sustainably in a little water treatment system that then we could use to treat water. It's cheap. Microbial methods have a couple of other advantages in addition to, you know, it's basically, you can think of it as powered by photosynthesis. So and as long as we have a little bit of iron in either the water or another source, it's actually pretty sustainable. So it's a kind of idea that works really well. And if you see how that works, at least for the case of arsenic 5+, it works really well. So this is like, says 100 grams of iron oxide could treat thousands and thousands of liters of arsenic containing groundwater, or as long as it's arsenic 5+. So there's different kinds of arsenic. It treats a little bit less for arsenic 3+. Again, the problem here is uranium. Uranium doesn't like to stick to anything. It's iron in water, at least water like South Dakota. And so what we need to do, this really tells us something. Our system that we try to do that with here, our system should be effective for arsenic if we can make iron oxides. We probably are going to have to do something else for the uranium. And it turns out these microbial populations are also good for that because they can chemically change the uranium into a form that sticks. So not only do we make iron oxides, but we can change the chemical form of uranium at the same stuck to the solids and out of your drinking water and into a treatment system so that we can drink safer water. How do we do that? Well, what we're in the midst of doing here, and I'm trying to be pretty brief, so I'm keeping it pretty simple. I'll let you guys ask questions here shortly, is we've designed a little system where we have a system here that creates iron, dissolved iron. It comes over here into this photosynthetic box. And the idea here is that light is going to shine onto this through a window, basically, a glass window here at the top of the box. And it will interact with the microbes that are living inside the water. There are microbes in all water samples, it turns out, not to scare you. Most of them are good, the kinds of microbes you want, not germs that you don't want, although there are plenty of those sometimes too. This light will then facilitate those microbes oxidizing iron and making an iron oxide that then can treat water, so that the water that flows in, if it had arsenic or uranium, the uranium and arsenic would stick for the two different reasons, and then the water that comes out, which you could envision your tap over here in a tap water system, it comes out meeting water quality standards for both, which are the main two contaminants that we have to worry about. This is what it looks like when you draw it up on a paper and make it look good in an engineering drafting kind of design. This is what it looks like in actuality when you start to print it. This is a picture from literally about a week ago, our first printing of such a device that we're hoping to actually pilot in the field. So what we're hoping to do is go in South Dakota, once we have tested a system like this in our lab, come out and work at an existing well, sure that these kinds of systems can work, and work with both Missouri Breaks and the Oglala Sioux Tribe Water Maintenance Conservation crew and others to basically try to find a system that will dependably treat water, as well as monitor the arsenic and uranium, so that we are sure that when you have a water treatment system that you're using, we have a better way of making sure it's actually working. Because one of the things I haven't talked about is it turns out, because water systems don't always work well and sometimes they get filled up, it's a common problem for your water treatment system that you do have not to work quite as well as you have. So with that in mind, I want to point out a couple key conclusions there. Your water is not, because your environment is not the same as everybody else's. It's very hard to use other people's wells information to predict what happened at your well. You should be measuring what happened at your well specifically. Okay, related to measuring those things is really important. If you are depending on a treatment system for water treatment to remove arsenic, most people don't have a treatment system designed to remove uranium, but if you have one for arsenic, it's really important to keep it up and maintain it to make sure it's working. And definitely, that's like a system. So that's one reason that we're trying to develop systems that'll hopefully be able to tell us when they're not working, and hopefully work for much longer as well. So as a research goal in solving problems, that's one of the things we are trying to do in an engineering sense.